I find myself increasingly doing research in North Africa and Southeast Asian cities, and it's become important for me to think seriously about the various ways in which the technologies of urbanization mediate human and non-human habitation of the Earth. In urban agglomerations like Cairo and Bangkok, for instance, the fact that the built environment is a geologic force is felt with a particular level of intensity. With this observation, I only mean to underscore what is already well known, and that is that interwoven planetary crises are felt unevenly across the globe and disproportionately affect the global south. And this is particularly true with technologies of urbanization in the world's megacities, whose rapid development in the so-called periphery have been shown to increase carbon emissions and decrease carbon sink capacity, accelerate inequalities in wealth, food, security, and health, degrade soil, water, and air quality, negatively impact biodiversity, and the list goes on. It is with these observations in mind that I approach recent social and ecological interventions made by what has come to be known as urban agroecology. As I discuss this theoretical and practical work this theoretical and practical work is an important site of resistance in two dominant modes of modern extractivism. Indeed, by fusing the critiques of urbanization on the one hand and industrial agriculture on the other, urban agroecology envisions the design of interwoven plant and microbial systems that aim to promote social and ecological justice in urban centers and repair the extraction and exploitation wrought by unchecked urban development and industrial food production. What becomes clear, however, is that in order for agroecological techniques to actually intervene in these processes, new ways of thinking about the scales and technologies of the urban form are necessary. Time permitting, this will open up a host of new questions about how to govern such interventions at scale and whether advanced computational technologies offer possibilities for urban agro-governance that would otherwise be unthinkable. These reflections will set the stage for a brief consideration of Alfred North Whitehead's view on the life of biological systems and how this might help us imagine the kind of architectures that make the life of coordinated plant and microbe ecosystems in urban centers a question of planetary responsibility. But first, let me say a few things about urban agroecology and what its goals are. Section 1. Sorry, I'm trying to. Good. Urban agroecology is a relative newcomer to the discourses on sustainable agriculture. It is less an official field than it is a patchwork of methods, practices, and discourses involving diverse stakeholders that aim to overturn decades-old models of urban agriculture. The trouble with urban agriculture is that it relies on top-down scientific management that focuses exclusively on metrics like yield per acre, vegetables per neighborhood, or production potential, and ultimately reproduce the idea of individual responsibility to solve systemic challenges. What we miss with such frameworks, according to critical agronomists, are the complex ways in which urban farming and the many of its associated benefits, such as food sovereignty and ecosystem restoration, are intimately connected to education, transportation, health history, sanitation regimes, and a wide range of other variables spread across complex urban environments. In other words, there are much wider systems of socio-technical relation that make the yield-focused discourse of urban agriculture possible, and many of these soft and hard infrastructures are conveniently disregarded or obscured in their models of productivity. What's missing is a serious consideration of not only biodynamic farming techniques, which is what tends to be emphasized in more sustainist discourses on urban farming, but also how access to ecosystem services is inextricably tied to much more complex social and political conditions. For instance, the soil quality and access to land on the outskirts of an urban agglomeration like Bangkok pales in comparison to the growing conditions of an informal settlement like Nang Learn, which is one of the densest areas in the city, where the topsoil is polluted, land tenure is insecure, and informality thrives. But food sovereignty and ecosystem restoration could not be more important. It's precisely this failure to account for the complexity of social ecological relations in urban farming and growing initiatives that has led many scholars, growers, and activists to look to agroecological frameworks for answers. To date, most of the academic and non-academic literature on agroecology stems from work done in rural settings in the 1980s and 1990s. More recently, the question for many has become, what does it mean to implement these principles in urban environments, especially when urbanization has swallowed up what used to be its rural outsides? I will come back to this below. But generally speaking, agroecology took off during this period in response to the devastation wrought by industrialized agriculture, characterized by monocropping, high external inputs, fertilizers, and biotech, the maximization of yield, and overall low complexity. As a science, agroecology promotes the transition to the ever slippery notion of sustainable growing practices by means of diversifying agricultural systems. While there's some variation in what this means, generally the design of such farming systems tends to adhere to the following principles: diversify crop structure and function, promote soil management and improves biological activity, implement nutrient cycling and organic matter, and foster practices that eliminate the cycling of systems. What distinguishes agroecology from other sustainable growing programs, however, is that it is equally a social movement. It not only recognizes that agriculture is a socio-political practice, which is already a huge advancement over other forms of industrial agriculture, but it also cultivates spaces for agricultural production where the goals of social and ecological justice supposedly align, which means that there's an affirmation of the full range of knowledge practices connected to land and heritage. Despite the fact that most of the work in agroecology is focused in rural areas, several factors have contributed to the sudden growth in urban agroecology. Most notably, what's often been referred to as planetary urbanization has shifted how we think about urban systems in relation to their rural outsides. We no longer live on a planet with relatively contained metropolitan worlds. The economic and infrastructural architectures of the urban expand far beyond the geographies of the so-called city and have managed to swallow up their countrysides, effectively using them for food, labor, and resources. What's more, exponential increase in the spaces, practices, and functions of informality, especially in the global periphery, have only expanded the technicities of the urban, transforming the urban form into an even more complex, less contained and ecologically exploitative technology of global capitalism than it has been for much of the 20th century. This realization has left many urbanists, designers, and activists struggling to counter the geosocial force that the urban has become, and moreover find the appropriate scale of intervention. It's in this context that we might understand the relevance of agroecology as a form of urban activism. It involves designing site-specific grow projects that aim to restore ecosystem services in dense urban areas without falling prey to the traps of urban agriculture, which is really just a species of industrialized agriculture. Of course, one of these traps is ignoring how urban growing is a social and political practice. This means that the variety of services derived from urban agroecosystems form the small-scale garden to the multi-neighborhood growing projects are dependent upon much wider and complex systems of human and non-human relation that promote or inhibit access to these services. Their availability is made possible by urban design operating simultaneously at very different scales. For instance, policy decisions and infrastructure design directly affect the concentrations of wealth and poverty in cities, and the services available to mitigate the contamination, disease, pollution, and education in these districts. Together, these and many other factors shape not only the ability to produce and consume food in cities, but also the willingness of urban dwellers to engage in agroecological farming at all, and not simply write it off as a space of privilege cultivated by gentlemen farmers who've already have had successful careers in real estate or finance. Put another way, the question of urban farming in an agroecological frame is an ongoing and shifting problem that is distributed across multiple human and non-human systems that overlap in highly specific ways in different urban settings to generate shifting and uneven relations among populations and the various services they derive from technicities of agro production. Section 2. Now, the importance of agroecosystem design in the context of rapid urbanization of the planet cannot be overstated. As a response to the twin forces of urbanization and industrialized agriculture, urban agroecology attempts to interfere with the destruction brought about by their articulation. By creating a space for the autonomous cultivation of land, food, and heritage through a deep engagement with their very conditions of production, the movement seeks to derail two of the great designs of modernity, the city and agriculture. In this frame, the development of urban agroecosystems function as sites of resistance, not only to the governance of food and human health in urban centers, but also to the systematic destruction of land and biodiversity through technologies of urban development. Despite this, urban agroecology is not without its theoretical and practical problems. For instance, among its advocates, there's a tendency to slip back into troubled divisions between the natural and the artificial, where agroecosystems are very often conceptualized as intermediate between natural and fabricated or human constructed systems, and too quickly tasked with bringing nature back into the city, or in any case, mimicking its principles in order to renaturalize the urban environment. The rural is often romanticized as the space of food production and tradition, and inherently closer to nature than the city, which is the space of consumption and commerce. It's the job of agronomists, then, to redesign urban environments so that natural systems are able to poke through the dense urban fabric. Little islands of rurality are given a chance to flourish and propagate, allowing knowledge to travel from the rural peripheries to the urban centers. The trouble with this story is both empirical and conceptual. On the one hand, as I've already noted, it's no longer tenable to make hard and fast distinctions between the urban and the rural. The hinterlands have been rapidly urbanizing since at least the mid-20th century, and this is perhaps nowhere more apparent than in urban agglomerations like Cairo, Lagos, Jakarta, Kinshasa, and Mexico City. Lefebvrean urbanists have been proclaiming this for decades now. Essentially, we live in a global urban reality where our entire biosocial existence on the planet depends on the technicities of uneven capitalist urbanization. Where for Lefebvre, this was a speculation about the process of urbanization. For us in the 21st century, it characterizes our shared, if unevenly felt, planetary condition. We live in a more or less continuous urban construct where the countryside is fully industrialized and used up by urban agglomerations. We live in a planetary city. And then, on the other hand, it's no longer viable, as if it ever was, to separate the natural from the artificial, or the biological from the technological. Not only do such divisions reinforce the bifurcations of modernity, responsible for the violence of using nature as transcendental criteria to judge what is and is not a deviation from it, But these divisions also fail to grasp the latest work in the biosciences. So-called natural processes like protein synthesis are not isolated from mediation by a host of environmental and social technologies. Although neo-Darwinians still like to fantasize that the DNA molecule acts alone as the agent of developmental and evolutionary change, in reality, countless extragenomic factors mediate the relation between genotype and phenotype, so that the toxins in urban environments and the soil, the water, and in the air shape the relation between gene and protein. There is nothing natural, untouched, or given about even the most basic processes in living systems. And this couldn't be more obvious than for the embryonic development of plants in dense urban settings. Here's what this means. Urban agroecology needs to update itself according to the conditions of our planetary urban reality. And this is a reality in which agroecological interventions resist idealizations of nature and conceive themselves not as biological, but as biotechnical reconfigurations of the urban. In doing so, they seek just and equitable access to services derived from agricultures and achieve this through actively critiquing and reimagining their conditions of production. They also see the redesign process as itself connected to much larger planetary forces, where everything from carbon sequestration to circuits of global labor are affected. While agroecology is traditionally engaged in local struggles, site-specific growing conditions, and situated knowledge practices, it's no less a distributed technology that intervenes in the textures of our urban planetary condition. In short, we cannot disentangle the local technicities of growing from much wider conditions of urbanization. Architecture has become a geologic force, and we need to design the tools capable of redirecting it. Now, it's precisely insofar as agroecology could be rethought as an intervention in the technologies of planetary urbanization that questions about the scale of technological intervention become pressing. While local and site-specific interventions are crucial to the agroecological design program and should not be taken for granted, would it not be in our best interest to imagine the coordination of relatively autonomous interventions in urban agglomerations across the globe to maximize their effect? Given the pace at which our species is destroying its only means of subsistence, and how our technologies of urbanization are contributing to this suicidal mission in unforeseeable ways, then does it not seem that our only option is to build robust platforms for governing technologies of agro-production and consumption across diverse urban environments? Of course, it's hard to imagine such a governing body, a ministry of the future, as Kim Stanley Robinson imagines it, that could actually be tasked with such an overhaul, that is, with managing radically divergent grow projects with the level of granularity that would be required. This is why algorithmic governance at scale has become an attractive option for some, and it is part of a broader conversation on the academic left about the importance of automation for building post-capitalist futures. Section 3. Before I get into these proposals, let me say a few words about what I'd like to call the automated left to contextualize. This is how I characterize theorists' influence in one way or another by Marx's abbreviated meditation on machines in the Grundrisse. It's repurposing by Italian post-operaismo, and its heroic reconfiguration by thinkers under the spell of 21st century speculative materialisms and realisms. This discourse, which is diverse and wide-ranging, has forcefully shaped the political imaginary on the left, turning computational technologies, machine learning, and other species of artificial intelligence into necessary infrastructure for building a post-capitalist future. And to be sure, many of the agroecological principles discussed at the beginning of this talk, look from the perspective of the automated left, like the local tactics of good old leftist critique, which bear all the traits of a nostalgic and even folk sensibility that has weighed down political thought and action for over half century and has failed to yield anything but small-scale, isolated victories that are ill-equipped to bring about the seismic shifts in political thought we require today. On their reading, by embracing rather than critiquing the forces of technological development, Marx already realized that machinic production and capitalist appropriation could be torn apart, leaving open the possibility for the emergence of a collective subject capable of exercising mastery over the production process, the common objectified in the machine system no longer being appropriated by the axiomatic of capital. If we move beyond the so-called dogmatic Marxisms that identify technology with fixed capital and dead labor, then we begin to see how, for Marx, the evolution of machinery also indexes a level of development of productive powers that are unleashed, but never totally contained by the capitalist economy. It's actually a quote from Tiziana Terranova. Within the dominant capitalist relations of production, the surplus labor that results from increased automation is reabsorbed into the capitalist economy. But for those who put inestimable faith in Marx's fragment on machines, disposable time can and should be reclaimed and serve as the basis for a new form of the commons. As the Italian media theorist Terranova argues, quote, we need to ask not only how algorithmic automation works today, mainly in terms of control and monetization, feeding the debt economy, but also what kind of time and energy it subsumes and how it might be made to work once taken up by different social and political assemblages, autonomous ones, not subsumed by or subjugated to the capitalist drive to accumulation and exploitation, end quote. In other words, marching orders are clear: subvert the exploitative uses of computational technologies and use them to build infrastructures that could support the production of a post-capitalist commons. And so by accelerating human labor's displacement by machines, we're accelerating the process by which capitalist relations of production are undermined, and this will free us up to imagine completely different possibilities for techno-scientific development, or so the story goes. And for these profits of speculative automation, everything from universal basic income to large-scale urban agricultural projects are imaginable outside capitalist relations of production. Now, here's why this matters for us. The algorithmic management of planetary scale phenomena, from the economy to urbanization, has fully merged with leftist thought, so much so that many are convinced that such bold thinking is the only way to get things done. And to be sure, the global governance of urban agroecosystems shares with the goals of these algorithmic Marxisms. As a matter of fact, one of the latter's strongest selling points is their full embrace of the complexity sciences and their acute sensitivity to the fact that the global relations of a system cannot be reduced to local patterns of behavior. Complex adaptive systems modeling, which is largely what drives developments in the evolutionary, geologic, and atmospheric sciences today, is well positioned to design the kind of infrastructure necessary to regulate local agricultural systems at the appropriate level of detail, map them onto global patterns of urban farming, and then anticipate the ways in which these patterns feed back into local systems. It's just this spirit of algorithmic urbanism that motivates media and design theorists like Benjamin Bratton, who propose urban governance strategies by the strategic deployment of artificial general intelligence. Such thinking about governance, planning, and urbanism is also what motivates speculative proposals for planetary urbanism like Planet City. Planet City, designed by architect Liam Young, is a planetary urban fiction that takes E.O. Wilson's proposal for half Earth as a design proposition. In it, our current planet city is remade, but in such a way that the human population in 2050 leaves more than half of the Earth to rewild. and retreats into a hyper-dense metropolis built from technologies freed from capitalist modes of production and open up to the many possibilities for them dreamed up by the automated left. Planet City hypothetically emerges from a global consensus after nation states fail to make meaningful progress on climate change. In this vision, all food and agriculture are fully integrated into the dense metropolis, where over 2,000 algae farms, 42 billion fruit trees, and countless other forms of vegetation grow vertically and horizontally in elaborate architectures of smart food production, interwoven with equally smart skyscrapers and other architectures of habitation for over 10 billion human residents. Where Young and others insist that Planet City is a fiction that should help us understand our present and more specifically direct our attention to how architecture is a geologic force. The Saudis, on the other hand, are less interested in using future cities to speculate and critique. Neom, which is currently under construction, whatever that means, is over 26,000 square kilometers. It is located in Tabuk province in northern Saudi Arabia and is just the kind of collision of capital and over-optimistic engineering that leads to ridiculous claims like Neom is a smart city, that Neom is not a smart city, rather it's the world's first cognitive city, a fully intelligent architecture in the desert. Neom, the founders claim, will use 100% renewable energy, and like Planet City, food will be produced within its walls and will integrate circular design principles and sustainable growing practices that promote the diversity of plant species, crop rotation, soil health, and aim to, and this is a quote, minimize food waste while maximizing the conversion of organic waste into agricultural input, end quote. In short, the goal is to integrate many of the principles of agroecology using machine learning and other species of AI in a self-sustaining desert city. What's remarkable about this project what's remarkable about this project, other than the levels of confidence its engineers and scientists display in the face of unrelenting criticism from competent scientists, is that Neom still manages to recruit prominent individuals to its cause. For instance, the Vice Chancellor for Academic Affairs and Provost of the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, recently announced that he will be the Neom University's first president. Not only is it troubling to see the pages of science fiction used as blueprints for the present, but it's also curious to see how closely this vision of Saudi capitalism parallels the proposals for speculative urbanisms spawned by the automated left, when these latter proposals are supposed to be such radical departures from everything we know. Section 4. Now, anecdotes aside, as I come to the end of this talk, I want to make something perfectly clear. This detour through the automated left and its design ambitions should not be taken as an endorsement. On the contrary, by rethinking agroecology as an intervention in the extractive and exploitative technologies of planetary urbanization, questions of scale and automation are essential to address. And it's not difficult to see why some might find themselves lured into thinking that urban growing practices need to be coordinated across diverse urban environments, and that the only way to manage this complexity is through technologies of agro-governance administered by automation technologies operating at a planetary scale. Still, such Promethean efforts to redesign urban growing at this scale is only imaginable, many insist, in a post-capitalist frame where the possibilities of techno-scientific production are freed from capitalist appropriation. This is all well and good and makes for good fun, this is all well and good and makes for fun philosophical and architectural sci-fi. However, I want to end here by noting two glaring problems with this formulation and then gestured toward a possible way forward. First, the algorithmic or automated left puts in an inestimable faith in the affordances of algorithmic mediation. Some of this stems from the fact that we are now in what is often called an AI summer, where funding and resources are thrown in the direction of anything that looks or smells like a machine learning application. Add to this the general discontent with the critique of instrumental rationality on the left, as well as the growing recognition that computing may be more complex than this critique can handle. The time is ripe for a new philosophical assessment of computing. And I agree with much of this. Along these lines, it's become more widely understood that computability does not foreclose uncertainty and indetermination. As the mathematician and computer scientist Gregory Chadin has shown, incomputable numbers are in fact at the very core of algorithmic processing. And this has led some to conclude that automation may very well generate forms of logico-rationality that are no longer subject to the critique of instrumental rationality, and may even be more expansive and more complex than reason's contingent realization in Homo sapiens. In short, AI may give us a taste of other parameters for sapience. Reason is an abstract protocol only incidentally and not essentially tied to carbon-based matter, and can be realized just as easily in silicon or some other material. What such neo-rationalist accounts fail to appreciate is that algorithmic systems are embedded in much larger material ecosystems, and they require extraordinary quantities of labor, resources, and data to perform even the most basic operations. In other words, machine learning is part of wider social, political, and biophysical environments, and these environments tend to get disregarded or sidelined in the enthusiasm over the possibilities of quote-unquote synthetic intelligence. And so to insist on the autonomy of these algorithmic systems is ultimately to disavow the planetary scale dependencies that make the illusion of autonomy possible. What this means is that the continued mystification and even quasi-theologization of deep learning techniques only masks the real planetary costs of artificial intelligence. AI is not alien to human intelligence in the way some might think then. It's rather that the work of human intelligence remains alienated from what it produces. What this means is that the planetary management of urban growing technologies through algorithmic governance just introduces new layers of global extraction and exploitation, and sidelines the social and ecological justice that is the centerpiece of agroecology. A passage from Benjamin Bratton's Terraforming sums this up rather well. Quote, "Because infrastructure automates decision," writes Bratton, "it is said to be depoliticizing if it works without new deliberation or misdeliberation." And more often than not, this is exactly the point. A political decision like where should the water come from and for whom should it becomes the infrastructural axiom of turning on a faucet. The meeting of the People's Assembly for water provision can adjourn and go home, end quote. Now, the trouble with this view of automated infrastructures is that they don't free humans, animals, and land from suffering and exploitation. Let's not forget that not everyone gets to go home because the meeting is adjourned, as Bratton suggests. The lights are still on at the office. Precarious workers are there cleaning up and preparing to make sure everything is ready for tomorrow's meeting. The second problem with this formulation concerns the fact that computational systems are not as complex as we actually need them to be. While this requires a much longer discussion about the possibilities and limitations of complex dynamical systems in the biosciences, suffice it to say that for the profits of algorithmic urban governance, plant and microbial ecosystems are complex systems that can be algorithmically understood and managed. And yet this fails to address the fact that the evolutionary and developmental trajectories of organismic systems are beyond the mathematical language of the complexity sciences. Despite the dominance of computational complexity in the biological sciences today, there are an increasing number of scientists, some of them who were, some of whom were at the forefront of developing models of biological complexity in the 1970s and 1980s, are pushing back on the ease at which researchers equate biological systems with computational systems. This is ultimately because biological, as opposed to other material systems, physical and chemical, for instance, cannot be reduced to physio-mathematical frames of reference. This is because there is no computational model that can actually compute the trajectories of a phenotype in phase space. The phase space of a plant phenotype, for instance, is non-probabilistic. And there is no way to algorithmically express how its potentials for development emerge alongside the material and energetic exchanges of the developing embryo. In other words, there is no transcendental phase space that can compute all possible paths of phenotypic development in advance of its unfolding. Some version of this thesis is also put forward by the renowned physicist Paul Davies, who argues that the epigenome is a non-algorithmic space that cannot even be materially located. He calls this actually a virtual object, which means that it is impossible to compute how the extra genetic environment will affect a developing system. While there are many theorists and philosophers who play fast and loose with the idea that the biological cell has circuitry and that techniques for bioengineering can alter the genome of plant species and then predict how the phenotype would develop and evolve using the mathematics of complexity, they are not wrestling with how the latest mathematics square with the messiness of wet systems, or in other words, how biological systems continue to resist algorithmic capture. The history of biology plainly demonstrates that biological systems and the worlds in which they are embedded are produced through various practices of human and non-human mediation. The epigenome is itself a mediating technology, at once connecting and disconnecting phenotype and genotype in a way that cannot be reduced to algorithmic procedures. This is hugely important for how we think about the architectures of urban agroecology. I say this because what's at stake in the design, cultivation, and management of plant and microbial ecologies in dense urban centers. And in spite of our best efforts to control and steer these ecosystems, to bend them to maximize carbon sink capacity, and to shape them in ways that amplify yield, all the while not degrading the health and soil and ensuring just and equitable access to food, the ways in which these ecosystems develop and evolve cannot be predicted. For even if the growing conditions of an heirloom tomato, for example, are meticulously managed through sophisticated data collection techniques and redesigned in real time, the phenotypic development of the tomato cannot be mapped in advance. Or put another way, a biological system cannot be objectified in another system. No matter how much data we collect about the system, the possibilities for its development emerge along with it in the present. They are its own, unique to it, and absolutely singular. As a final point, notice how close we are to what the mathematician and philosopher Alfred North Whitehead says about the life of biological systems. Biological systems are not out there, untouched, pristine, or natural for Whitehead. They are constructed just like any other system, physical or technical, out of what came before them. They are shaped by the inheritance of what he calls a common element of form, essentially by their ability to incorporate the organizing principle of another into its own constitution. It is in this sense that biological systems are thoroughly relational. The other, in fact, every other that came before it, is literally in the system under formation. Still, Biological systems, as opposed to physical systems, are also able to incorporate higher degrees of novelty, of pure anarchic disorder than non-biological systems. This anarchy, this bid for freedom, is what Whitehead calls life. Life is singular, immediate, and incapable of being objectified in another system. Life is thoroughly non-relational, and yet it is the life of a biological system that allows it to respond to stresses in the environment, to adapt to pressures, and to mutate in unanticipated ways. This is why, according to Whitehead, a biological system is said to protect life, provide shelter for it, without letting life overwhelm it. When life becomes too much to take, the organism dies. And in the event that life is successfully sheltered by a plant microbe system, for instance, this is an achievement of every other system, whether biological, technical, social, or geophysical. This is because of the relational bond that each and every system shares with every other system, however faint or seemingly unimportant. The entire interwoven system is responsible to some degree for whatever successes or failures result from protecting or failing to protect life. Stepping back, it becomes clear now that from a Whiteheadian's perspective, we have yet to understand the problem facing urban agroecology. It has much less to do with designing the right algorithms to manage and predict the efficiency of plant and microbial ecosystems at scale, and much more to do with finding the right ways to protect and promote what cannot, in fact, be understood or controlled. The issue for urban agroecology can be boiled down to something rather basic from an architectural perspective, namely, how do we design the appropriate shelters to protect life in cities? Only now, the design and construction of plant shelters that's at stake, not control, not optimization, but hospitality. Hospitality to what cannot be represented or objectified, but in need of protection and nurturing through the coordination of radically diverse systems across various scales of organization that refuse to allow a transcendental perspective, computational or otherwise, to authorize what life is and for whom it matters most. Vegetal architectures to push agroecology in a new direction would function then as sites for coordinating the protection of non-objectifiable life, although in such a way that every system is also responsible for the maintenance of vegetal shelters to some degree. This is not to write off or dismiss the use of sophisticated computing technologies to assist in this design work, far from it. Rather, what I'm resisting here is the temptation to use these technologies to define or characterize what's possible for life instead of using them as important media capable of assisting in the design of shelters for it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for this wonderful perspective.
Okay, I don't know where to start from. So, first, what you're arguing here reminds me so much of Kerry Wolf's critique of post-humanism. He's sometimes accused of oversimplifying the position of the likes of Catherine Hills and the other classical post-humanists by sometimes perhaps even quite openly reducing them to transhumanism and their vision of the perfect universe where everything is rational to and that there is nothing that can escape control, that there is nothing that can escape reason. It seems like reason and control are actually equated within this logic.
Sure.
which I agree is shared by the neo-rationalists, by the accelerationists, and they're almost naive, Promethean belief, and reason, whatever they understand by it. So what you demonstrated here today is that similarly as in nature, also in computing, there is entropy.
Yeah.
And entropy cannot be controlled. And as we know from thermodynamics, entropy is actually high. Climate has not been instrumentalized, has not been transformed into commodity, has not been subjected to the purposes of human use. So has not been subjected to human technology for the sake of instrumentalization. Let's put it that way. It's interesting how actually entropy in terms of thermodynamics is so human-centric, by the way. So in a way, what you're telling us that there are limits to this techno-optimism, let's say, and you are warning us that it should be subjected to some sort of you already demonstrated what sort of a critical position we might have toward this, but do you have any further more elaborate recommendations to the activists, to the advocates of the new Green Deals, etc., what elements and aspects of them are problematic and unrealistic? You kind of intimated we are problematic. The natural resources are not endless.
Yeah, no, that's
alternative sources of energy. So,
yeah, no, thank you for that. No, you summarized the position really well. Yeah, I mean that's really good. And I share a lot with I would say Carrie's critique of a particular version of posthumanism. So maybe I'll start there. So I think that's spot on. I also I suppose part of the longer project is actually bigger project is trying to make sense of a lot of the work that I'm doing as director for the Center for Philosophical Technologies in places like Cairo and Bangkok and Bogota and so forth that are taking real efforts to do a kind of urban agricultural project that are very site specific and so forth, but thinking more than just food sovereignty, but thinking about ecosystem restoration, right? So I think this is the sort of on the ground kind of practical design work that I'm imagining, and the people that I'm working with and I'm interested in working with, right? And that there is, there is this kind of within this work as well, this kind of especially the kinds of programs that are not just interested in the I guess you could say the sort of urban agricultural program, or that they're also interested in layering in questions of food sovereignty and this kind of social justice discourse, whatever that means, because that has so many different ways of being interpreted. Layering this into these sort of design and engineering programs, right? But there's also, in a lot of this work, and I think I gestured toward it at one point during the talk, there's a kind of naivete there as well, because it goes right back to a kind of discourse that separates, the urban as artifice and the, ecosystem restoration and the sort of holistic ecological relationship to growing practices and urban farming and so forth as the sort of rural outside that tries to bring nature back in and so forth, right? So this is why I was suggesting that we do need something like a understanding something like an urban biotechnical intervention, right? That we can't sort of abstract out or create artificial divisions between these two. So the landscape of these sorts of site-specific interventions has to become much more complex and adapted to sort of, planetary conditions of urbanization, but also thinking about, the scales at which, computational systems run. So this is what sort of led into this conversation about, okay, well, there are people who are thinking about, planetary urbanization, and they're also thinking about computation at scale. And I think this is incredibly important to think about. And this is also, the scale at which interventions need to be happen. But of course, that there's this very quick and especially within a particular kind of leftist discourse or pseudo-leftist discourse for some folks, it's like this becomes a sort of planetary management program, right? The new terraforming that is operationalized in very specific ways, and that there's also a kind of philosophical the kind of philosophical work that's done by the neo-rationalists, if you like, right? And it shows itself in the practical program and planetary management strategies. But I also think that, this isn't the way we need to go either. And I think that, and this is the sort of critique that I'm trying to develop. I mean, on the one hand, through a close reading of what's going on when we think about living systems and computational systems and the complexity of the biological sciences today and what the biological sciences are saying. So yes, there is this very popular, sort of bioengineering discourse, and yes, we can sort of think about all the sort of amazing things that are happening with CRISPR-Cas9 and synthetic biology and so forth. But this is only one fraction of what's happening in the biosciences, because there's a much richer understanding of the sort of complexity of living systems as time-based systems that really can't be captured by the kind of language of computational complexity. So when you start thinking about these sorts of things, a much more complex picture comes into. We have a much more complex picture of how we're going to think about urban systems, agricultural systems, and computing systems, and the sort of overlapping domains, if you like. I don't know if that answers your question. I'm just, it's a sort of, yeah.
In whatever project, either get the ending because they have so many variations. That's something that Benjamin Bratton used to run in Russia, right? Then I remember that as a topic, it was very important that 2-3 events that I won't say in this case because I'm still a member of the board of directors of the new center for research and practice we organized on this topic. So I know the discourse, but I never knew, and now I'm learning from you that these things are being operationalized and policies and concrete, like changes in our reality. It's not just intellectual conversation anymore.
Yeah, no.
Okay, so we have an ideological enemy.
Yeah, no, it's interesting because this becomes part of the new avant-garde discourse in, computational architecture and design, right? Is that, using these tools at scale, and you also have this sort of philosophical justification for, how we think about artificial general intelligence as this, there is a kind of post-humanist discourse running through it that, we need to start thinking about reason or intelligence as as fully alien in this sense, right? That it operates at planetary scales, and it's so far beyond us, and we have to, and there's sort of like genealogical situating, projects that sort of genealogically situate this far, way earlier in time than the kind of computational histories that we're generally given, and that exceed us as well. So I think that especially, I guess the sort of critical program here is that, within the sort of good old fashioned situated critical programs on the left, we have to get much more savvy about thinking about computational systems, what computational systems are, how they work, how computational systems are designing planetary cartographies. That is happening, but it's not one planet. They're designing different planets constantly. I mean, this is one of the other things that, and this is part of another project that I'm working on, is thinking about how we can't have just one planetarity. There are multiple planetarities, right? Every time that an AI builds a model, a deep neural network builds a model, it's not the same model. There are different parameters. There are different, I mean, it's using ephemeral data that can't be retraced. So if you try to map these kinds of planetary systems, the resources, the labor, and the data, which some people are doing in sort of critical data studies, this isn't one planet. There's no way to actually point to that world out there and go, hey, this is the planet we're extracting, because every time we build a model, it's different. So this is an ongoing planetary project that different planets are being designed constantly, right? Yeah, absolutely. So I mean, this is, yeah, right. And this is why somebody like Whitehead is so important to me, is because this is a sort of process ecology, in the sense that, you know, system environment, the system, being the algorithmic system, constructs its environment just as much as the environment constructs it. Yeah.
Everything I was, because done some field work, and my question is, to what extent, for example, implementation of agroecology, or this concept, depends on the specific economic conditions? Especially because I'm studying this, because our country and the region of the Western Balkans actually characterize the category of that energetic poverty. So I how, let's say, to implement this concept of agroecology in such a context.
Yeah. No, I mean, it's a great question. I mean, I think this is, I mean, this gets to the heart of it, right? Because part of the, you know, agroecological program, especially within urban context, is thinking about the economies that are able to produce this. Because and this is part of the issue also with thinking about urban agriculture as opposed to urban agroecology, is urban agriculture is largely not site specific. It's not thinking about the wider social and political and economic frames that are able to produce it and sustain it. I mean, this is the other issue, right? This is the sustainment of it, and not thinking about it in terms of these wider systems, if you like, right? So because, you know, I mean, you know, it was interesting when I was recently in Cairo and getting a tour of some of the, you know, certain urban farms that have been you know, produced by a local community architecture firm for different communities, and they work with the communities to develop them and set them up and so forth. But really, then it just became, I mean, they weren't actually never maintained, right? In fact, the architecture firm was the one who had to come and maintain them all the time, mostly because there wasn't the social and political discourse around this sort of thinking about food sovereignty, if you like, and that sort of it wasn't, and really that then even when the Grow project was going, it became and like thriving a little bit. It was about territorial disputes. Who's going to manage it? Who's going to manage it when it comes to yield? You know, who takes what, right? And so just it became actually a new site for territorial disputes within a city, right? And not actually something that was like, you know, part of this dream of you know, sharing a you know, an urban farm or something like that, right? But that was largely because, and one of the lessons there was that's because it, you know, food and growing and ecosystem restoration in this space in Cairo wasn't thought about as a social, political, and economic problem. Yeah. So yeah, I mean, that's a great question. Yeah, I mean, I don't know exactly. I mean, I'm familiar with the context in the Balkans, but it's, I mean, it has to be economic. Absolutely.
Any other questions?
Well, thank you for coming. Thank you.